Welcome back, everyone, to the Mostly True Adventures of Homer P. Figg by Rodman, Philbrick. We're on chapter 30. This is called When the Screaming Comes Inside. When we last left Homer, he had escaped from the Union cavalry, who had come to arrest Professor Fleabottom, in a surveillance balloon. The balloon has got a rip in the fabric, and now the balloon is falling out of the sky. Let's rejoin Homer. As we drop closer to the ground, everything speeds up. It's like the earth is turning faster, whipping great trees at the basket and barely missing. Then we're flying over rocky fields, Tilda and me. Fields where men on horseback chase one another, firing guns and waving swords. Suddenly the ground explodes under the horses, and man and beast vanish in a flash of blood-stained lightning. We're being swept over a battlefield, and what I thought was thunder and lightning is artillery shells blowing the world to pieces. Right about then, the rip in the silk catches fire, and the fabric starts to melt. I scramble over the side of the basket, clinging with my fingers, deciding when to jump. All I catch is a glimpse of green water, but with the balloon dissolving into red-hot flames, making up my mind is no longer an option. I must let go and take my chances. I drop through the air like a screaming stone, plunging feet first into a scummy green frog pond. When you're falling from 100 feet or more and the sky's on fire, even scummy water is better than solid ground. At least the fall don't kill me. Trouble is, I can't find the surface. Can't tell which way's up because my fists are full of mud like I've been clawing at the bottom, and my legs are caught in a tangle of lily pad roots that want to tug me down. I'm trying to breathe the warm, slimy water. If frogs could do it, why not me? When something grabs hold of my hair and yanks me up into the sunlight. Can't see right off because I'm coughing so hard, but after a few minutes of having the water shook out of me, I realize I've been saved by a scrawny little man in a gray uniform. He's missing his front teeth, and his tongue keeps sliding over to the gap as he shakes me. Then he hands me over to a bunch of men in gray uniforms that have been refreshing their horses at the edge of the pond. So they're wearing gray, which means they're part from the South. They're part of the Confederate Army. The fact that they have horses means they're probably part of the cavalry. And the head of the cavalry was General Jeb Stuart, another Virginian. If you know anything about Jeb Stuart, if you've been reading about the Civil War on your own, then you'll recognize the description when he enters the story. Cavalry, from the look. They talk funny, kind of slow and lilting, but I can understand them well enough. Little critter fell out of the sky, did he? Yes, sir, like he'd been shot from a cannon. No, it wasn't no cannon, sir. He came by way of surveillance balloon. That's what's left of it, burning in those trees over yonder. Is that a fact? Yes, sir. Must be a Yankee spy getting a fix on our position. Sir, he ain't but a boy. Another, more powerful voice cuts through the argument. What have we here? Report. Rough hands pass me along to where a beautifully uniformed man sits on horseback, hands folded over the pommel. Looks like he lives in the saddle and likes it there. He wears an elegant cape and a rakish hat decorated with a long plumed feather. A fancy sword hangs from his waist. Definitely Jeb Stuart. Yankee boy fell out of a balloon, General Jeb, sir. The dashing young general leans down from the saddle to study me. Makes a show of tugging at his thick, full beard. Might be a boy, he drawls, a twinkle in his eye. And might be he's a midget spy just to look like a boy. I wouldn't put it past them clever Yankees to fool us with midgets and whatnot. Yes, sir. The men are grinning as if they know their general likes to make jokes. What's your name, midget man? The general demands. I have miles to ride and I haven't the time or stomach for any more tomfoolery. Tell me your name. Homer Figg, and I ain't no midget. Yankee for sure. Take him to the bullpit. Turns out a bullpit is where prisoners get confined. And in this case, the pit is a stall in an old barn that's been temporarily requisitioned by the Confederate forces who stand guard outside. Requisitioned being another word for stole, which is what armies do when they need things. All of which is explained to me by a bright young fellow named Jonathan Griswold, who says he's a correspondent for the Valley Spirit, a newspaper in Chambersburg. I should be in the office setting type, he explains, but our fine little city has lately been overrun by invading rebels. They requisitioned all of the bread and grain, and every spare saddle, and all the horseshoes, and nails for the horseshoes, and they looked about ready to requisition the printing press and me. Seemed a good opportunity to venture out and see the war. Mr. Jonathan Griswold has a mousy brown mustache, a pair of reading spectacles hanging from a ribbon around his skinny neck, and a whole cavalry of ideas and opinions at his command. He says, I rode out from a little town called Gettysburg, expecting to find the Union Army, and was intercepted by Stuart's raiders, who take no particular affection for Yankee newspapermen. I take it you were seized by the same fellows? The man had a feather in his hat. Jeb Stuart himself? The newspaperman says, sounding impressed. They say he can ride circles around the Union Army and will report back to Robert E. Lee before the main battle starts. He called me a midget, I complained, still incensed. A midget and a spy. The newspaperman chuckles. Did he now? Oh, they've taken away my notebook, but I must remember that. A midget and a spy. That's an improvement on tales about girls who disguise themselves as soldiers and dogs who save their masters. I can see you're no midget, sir. But if, as they tell me, you arrived by surveillance balloon, then surely you really are a spy of sorts. And too young for hanging, lucky for you. Outside the stall, the Confederate guards are acting ever so casual, smoking their pipes and complaining about the rations, but I can tell they're keeping keen ears for our conversation. So, I decide to tell the newspaper man all about traveling with Professor Fleabottom, and that he's really a rebel patriot arrested by the Union Army, and how I escaped in a stolen balloon. Why would Homer want to pretend that he's on this side, or that he escaped from the Union? I mean, he really did escape, but why is he going to invent the story that he is going to invent? He said his true name is Crockett. Reginald Robert Crockett, I say, as my tale concludes. He's got a brother, Levi, that they beat up something awful. Crockett, you say? The newspaperman exclaims. Well, that's a famous name in the South. Was your medicine showman related to Davy Crockett that died at the Alamo? Must have been, I say, working up some enthusiasm for the idea. In fact, I'm sure he is. I once saw him kill a mountain lion with his bare hands. Must be the Crockett blood. A mountain lion? Extraordinary. Bare hands, you say? Well, of course it was an old lion, missing most of its teeth. Escaped from a circus. And you were employed by Mr. Crockett, also known as Professor Fleabottom. You might say so, I say grandly. I was the star of the show. Star of the show? In what capacity? Well, I played the amazing wolf boy, raised by wolves, and so on. The newspaper man is nodding feverishly, as if anxious to write it down, if only he had pen and paper. The Confederate guards lean closer, hanging on my every word, just as I planned. Of course, I wasn't really raised by wolves, I confide. I'm a Figg. You probably heard of the Figgs. We're the richest family north of Boston. Figgs own most of the timber, a railroad, a good portion of the mines, and a fleet of schooners, plus too many farms and factories to bother mentioning. Why, we even own slaves, I add, eyeing the guards. Why is he saying that? again, because the Confederates are on the side of, they want to keep slavery, and so Homer is going to try to make them think that he is on their side. Do you think they'll believe him? Why, we even own slaves, I add, eyeing the guards. Dozens of them. Hundreds, probably, if you took the trouble to count. We Figgs favor slavery. My father, when he was governor, he wrote a law saying every man must own a slave. Owning slaves is what makes America great. Everybody knows that. Everybody but that fool Lincoln. My father says if Lincoln was to take away our slaves, he would chop old Abe down like Washington chopped down the cherry tree. Would he really? Asked the newspaper man, looking aghast. Of course he would. Give up our slaves? Never. It's slaves that make us rich. Slaves that make us happy. Slaves that make the pancakes and churn the butter and boil the syrup. My father once gave me a slave whose job it was to follow me around and sweep away my footprints so I could pretend to be invisible. That's how many slaves we owned, that he could spare one just for erasing footprints. I see, says the newspaper man doubtfully. Point is, we Figgs may be from Maine, but our hearts lie with the Southern rebels. Yes, sir. Never met a slave I didn't want to own. Fact is, most every slave I ever saw, we did own. Hundreds of them, you say, in Maine, with your, wealthy family. Not wealthy, rich. Rich is better. More slaves if you're rich. The Confederate guards are nodding at one another, and one of them turns to leave. I figure he's off to tell his boss that they put a true friend of the South in jail by mistake. Well, that's when the screaming starts and ruins my plan. A terrible screaming that puts a chill down my spine and makes my knees shiver. A screaming that makes the guards forget the amazing story of the boy in the balloon. What's that? I asked the newspaper man, whose face has gone gray. I think I know, he says. He pulls himself up to the barred window in one corner of the stall and has a look. He drops back down and wipes his sweaty hands on his trouser legs. The wounded, he explains. The battle must have begun. They're bringing wounded to the barn. And then the doors burst open, and the screaming comes inside. Chapter 31. On the terrible first day of July. They come by the cartload, moaning soldiers stacked in flatbed wagons or carts drawn by horses or by hand. Mostly the wounded scream only when the cart hits a bump. Some have already stopped screaming and are put aside as the carts are unloaded, their faces covered with a scrap of cloth. The rest are carried into the barn on litters, awaiting treatment. Dozens and dozens of men, many of them crying out for their mothers, wives, or their sweethearts. The dozens soon become 100, stacked inside the barn and out under the shade of the eaves. The Battle of Gettysburg has begun, the newspaper man confides. They say that for a part of the day the Union cavalry held its own, but are now being driven back through the town. According to our guard, thousands of Union troops have surrendered or been taken prisoner. The rebels expect that Lincoln's army will be defeated in a day or two, just as they were at Chancellorsville, and then General Robert E. Lee and his troops will invade Washington from the north and declare victory. Is it true? I want to know. The North is lost? Truth, the newspaper man says, shaking his head. Truth is hard to come by when the bullets are flying. The battle won't be truly won or lost until the dead are counted. The rebels may be winning at Gettysburg, but their triumph is not without cost. Most of the wounded have been gravely injured, and the rebel surgeons are as busy as carpenters, prying out bullets and sawing off limbs. The only thing worse than a man screaming in pain is the sound of the saws cutting through bone. A good surgeon's like a good butcher. He knows his cut of meat. He'll roll up his sleeves, administer a little ether if he's got it, and have a leg off and the stump cauterized in a few minutes. the newspaper man explains. Longer than that, and the man will die of pain, or loss of blood, or both. As it is, less than half of these men will survive the day, and of those that do, another half will die of infection. Well, then I don't hear no more of what he's got to say because I'm covering my ears to muffle the screaming and the terrible wet noise of the saw. I curl up facing the wall so as not to watch the horrible business of tending to the wounded. Inside my head, I'm praying that Harold has not seen the elephant or been injured or worse. Best thing might be if he surrendered or was taken prisoner. But that's foolishness. A boy brave enough to stand up to Squint Leach would never surrender to no rebel. Knowing Harold, he's probably been promoted on the battlefield. Heck, if I don't find him soon, he'll likely be the youngest general in history. And that's what I cling to, the thought of Harold somehow surviving. A fever dream of hope that I'll find him before he's killed and we'll escape back to Maine, and kindly Mr. Brewster will take us in and we'll live like proper people with beds to sleep in and 3 squares a day and milk and pie in the evenings. We'll sit by the fire, jawing with Mr. Brewster, and help the escaped slaves if they still need help, and make sure that Bob the horse has plenty of hay and oats if he wants them. I'll go to school like our dear mother intended, and I'll learn everything there is to know about the world. I'll learn how to stop people from starving and put an end to wars and slavery and meanness and cruelty. And Harold will manage the tourmaline mines for Mr. Brewster. In my dream, Harold will be happy and strong and find him a wife to darn his socks of an evening and give him children that are never hungry and never get beat or locked in the barn like animals and never have to run away to war to save their big brothers and see arms and legs being stacked like cordwood or men dying of their wounds or hear the keening of boys who miss their mothers and beg to see her in heaven. They say that even in the worst battles, some of the troops survive. Please, dear Lord, let that someone be my big brother. That's all I'm asking. Don't let him die in a pony cart jammed with the wounded, or tied to a plank while they saw his limbs off one by one, or carried home in a casket wagon. Please, dear Lord, please let him be okay, wherever he is, and tell him that Homer is coming. Along about noon, something changes. The cartloads of wounded stop arriving, and the pitiful moaning slacks off, and the weary surgeons and their assistants wash the blood from their hands and have something to eat and drink. The horses and ponies that survived the battle are fed and watered too, and some of them are put into stalls next to me and Jonathan Griswold, the newspaper man, where they neigh and nicker and rub themselves nervously against the stalls as if trying to scratch away the fright of what they've been through. History's happening today, the newspaper man laments, fiddling with his spectacles. And I'm stuck in a barn with the dumb animals, blind as a bat. I've not even pen and ink to mark down rumors of these great events. At least you have a hand to write with, even if you ain't got a pen, I remind him. True enough, he admits. I should count my blessings. There's triumphant talk among the troops that the war has finally been won, that the Confederate troops will soon sweep away the last of the Union Army and either kill them or take them prisoner. The newspaper man, keeping his voice low, confides that it may be just as they say, but that the rebels have been chasing victory for 2 years and have never quite gotten there. He says that while each man the South loses is gone forever, the more populous North has more men to lose, and many more that can be drafted to replace them. In the end, it's a game of numbers, not so much who has the will to win, but who has the most men and material to sacrifice. The war is a meat grinder, as you have seen. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a messenger arrives, shouting at the top of his lungs, "To the front! All men fit for fighting are commanded to the front! The Union Army flees, and General Lee orders all fit men to the chase! How about 'em, boys? We got 'em on the run at last!" The barn is suddenly alive with cries for victory. Even some of the most desperate wounded beg to be taken back into battle, with rifles placed in their shivering hands. "All men to the front! All men to the front! Long live the South! Long live Robert E. Lee!" The men guarding us have been affected by the excitement. They pick up their weapons and haversacks and race from the barn to join their comrades, leaving me and the newspaper man pretty much alone. "Now's our chance," I whisper. "I'll take the smallest horse." He firmly shakes his head. "I dare not," he says, sounding regretful. "They will shoot me for certain." "Will they shoot a boy?" I ask. He shrugs. "Well, who can say what men will do when the heat of battle is upon them? But these rebels are decent enough. They'll be aiming for men in blue uniforms." He looks at me with great concern. "But why flee? I thought you favored the South, and that your family owned slaves by the dozen." "By the hundreds," I tell him. "All lies. The only side I favor is named Harold Figg, and I will find him or die trying." "There's an excellent chance you will succeed in dying," he warns me. "Best stay here and keep your head down." "I made a promise," I explain. "Remember my name in case I am forgot. Homer Figg of Pine Swamp, Maine." A moment later, I'm over the stall and leading a pony to daylight.